The air in the basement was freezing, but sweat dripped down Tsar Nicholas II's face as he looked into the eyes of his 13-year-old son, Alexei, and saw only the terror of a child who knew he was about to die. It was just after midnight on July the 17th, 1918. The former emperor of all Russia, the man who had once ruled 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, stood in a cramped, dimly lit room in the basement of a merchant's house in Ekaterinburg, a city deep in the Ural Mountains. Around him, pressed against the floral wallpaper, stood his wife Alexandra, his 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their small retinue of loyal servants. They had been woken from their beds minutes earlier, told they were being moved to a safer location. The White Army, counter-revolutionary forces loyal to the old order, was approaching the city. Perhaps rescue was near. The Tsarina, exhausted and hopeful, had dressed the children and helped them down the creaking wooden stairs. She believed she was walking towards safety. She was walking toward a wall of drunken men with revolvers. A short, stocky man named Yakov Yurovsky stepped forward. He commanded the guards who had been watching over the imperial family for months, and now he held a piece of paper in his trembling hands. He began to read. His voice was flat, mechanical, as if he were reciting a grocery list rather than a death warrant. Nicholas, confused, interrupted him. "What? What was that?" he asked, turning his head. Yurovsky repeated the sentence. The Tsar barely had time to comprehend the words before the first bullet smashed into his chest. What followed was not a clean execution, it was a slaughter. The guards, many of them drunk, had been assigned targets, but when the moment came, they panicked. They fired wildly into the small room. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid, burning the lungs of everyone inside. The room became a chaos of screams, gunshots, and the sickening thud of lead hitting flesh. According to some accounts, the Tsarina and one of her daughters tried to make the sign of the cross, but they were cut down before their hands could finish the gesture. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, off the stone floor, and horrifyingly, off the bodies of the young Grand Duchesses. Unknown to the killers, the women had sewn priceless jewels into their corsets, hoping to smuggle them to a future life of exile. When the guards opened fire at close range, some of the bullets failed to penetrate the thickly padded fabric and hidden jewels, leaving the young Grand Duchesses wounded but still alive. The assassins stared in disbelief. Their victims were not dying. So they drew their bayonets and moved in. In the corner, the boy Alexei, a hemophiliac who had spent much of his life unable to walk without pain, lay trembling on the floor beside his father. He was moaning softly. Yurovsky approached the child, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots directly into his head. Another guard stabbed the boy with a bayonet. The screams eventually stopped. In the span of perhaps 20 minutes, a dynasty that had ruled Russia for 304 years was extinguished, not in a grand battle or a glorious last stand, but in a stained and smoky basement, buried under a pile of bodies and the stench of cordite and blood. How could this happen? How could the mightiest autocrat of Europe, the heir to a throne that traced its lineage back to Peter the Great, and, through marriage, to the ancient dynasty of Ivan the Terrible, end up face down on a cold floor, his children bayoneted like animals in a slaughterhouse? The answer to that question is not found in a single event. It is not found in the simple madness of a single man. It is found in a perfect storm of disaster, delusion, and desperation that swept across the vast Russian Empire. It is a story of how an ancient, crumbling system of absolute power collided with the unstoppable force of a modernizing world. It is a story of war and famine, of idealism and terror, of a revolution that began with women marching for bread and ended with children being butchered in the dark. This is the entire history of the Russian Revolution, from Tsars to Soviets, from gilded palaces to secret police basements, from a world of divine right to a world where men believed they could build paradise on earth, only to construct a hell that would echo through the 20th century and beyond. And it begins, as all great tragedies do, not with a roar, but with a quiet, almost invisible crack at the very foundation of a giant made of clay. Imagine, if you can, the Russian Empire at the dawn of the 20th century. Stretch your mind across a map of the world. The empire was so vast that when the sun rose over the Pacific Ocean on its eastern edge, touching the shores of Siberia, it was still setting, 12 hours later, over the Baltic Sea in the west. 1/6 of the planet's land surface. A single nation, a single man ruled it all. The Tsar. And in 1894, that man was Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, a 26-year-old who had never wanted the job and was, by every account, spectacularly unprepared to hold it. But before we meet the man who lost an empire, we must understand what kind of empire he inherited. It was a paradox, dressed in military uniforms and gilded Orthodox crosses. On the surface, Russia presented a face of terrifying power and sublime beauty. St. Petersburg, the capital city built by Peter the Great on the bones of tens of thousands of conscripted laborers, swallowed by the marshes, was a masterpiece of European architecture. Its grand boulevards, the pastel facades of the Winter Palace, the golden spire of the Admiralty glittering in the watery northern light, all of it screamed civilization, power, and permanence. The Tsar's court was the most magnificent in Europe, a swirling spectacle of diamonds, silk, and military braid. When Nicholas was crowned, the ceremony in Moscow's ancient Kremlin was a deliberate, theatrical reminder of a sacred, unbroken chain stretching back to the crowning of the first Romanov, Michael, in 1613. But if you stepped outside the palace gates, you entered a different world. You left the marble and entered the mud. You left the champagne and smelled the rot. Because the splendor of Imperial Russia was built on a foundation of human suffering almost beyond comprehension. 80% of the empire's population, 80 out of every 100 souls, were peasants. And until just one generation before Nicholas took the throne, the vast majority of those peasants had been slaves. They were called serfs. They were tied to the land, bought and sold like cattle by the noble families who owned the vast estates. A serf was not a citizen. A serf had no rights, no recourse, no voice. If a landowner wished to flog a peasant for a minor infraction, he could. If he wished to send a young man away to the army for 25 years of service, essentially a death sentence, he could. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II, Nicholas's grandfather, had performed what was called the Great Emancipation, freeing the serfs. It was an act of immense moral weight on paper. In reality, it was a tragic half-finished reform that left the peasants crushed by debt and bound to communal villages that were starved for land. They were legally free, but economically chained. They looked at the vast fields owned by the noblemen who had once owned them and asked a simple, explosive question: whose land is this really? The answer to that question would echo like thunder 30 years later. While the peasants lived in wooden huts that blackened with smoke in the winter, with one of the highest child mortality rates in the world, roughly 1 in 4 children died before the age of 5. The empire around them was lurching violently into the industrial age. Russia, desperate to keep pace with its rivals Britain, France, and the rising power of a unified Germany, had thrown open its doors to foreign capital. French and Belgian investors poured money into Russian railways, including the monumental Trans-Siberian, a steel ribbon that would eventually connect Moscow to the Pacific. Factories mushroomed in the cities. St. Petersburg and Moscow swelled with a new class of people, the industrial proletariat. These were peasants, often still wearing their traditional tunics, who had been pushed off the land by poverty and pulled into the cities by the promise of wages. What they found in the factories was a nightmare. In the mills and metalworks, men, women, and children worked 14, 15, 16 hours a day. They lived in overcrowded barracks, sometimes sleeping in shifts, one group rising from a filthy mattress to go to work, just as another group collapsed onto it. There were no unions. Strikes were illegal. A worker who complained could be arrested, beaten, or sent back to his village in disgrace. The air in the factory districts was thick with soot and the smell of industrial chemicals. The water was undrinkable. Tuberculosis and typhus were constant companions. And in the midst of this misery, a strange, dangerous thing began to happen. These former peasants, crammed together in the dark, began to talk. They began to read illegal pamphlets, passed from hand to grimy hand. They began to dream of a different world. If you want to understand the Russian Revolution, you must understand this pressure cooker. You have an autocratic government that allows no political expression whatsoever. Not a parliament with real power. Not a free press. Not a town council that can truly govern. Every single decision flows from the top, and the top is an emperor who believes, with every fibre of his being, that God has placed him there to rule with absolute authority. As one of Nicholas's ministers famously said, "There is no citizen who can rest assured that his home won't be searched and he himself won't be arrested." The secret police, the Okhrana, opened mail, infiltrated student groups, planted informants in factories, and tracked dissidents across the continent of Europe. A dictatorship, as long as it appears strong and unified, can seem terrifyingly stable. But the moment it shows a crack, the moment weakness is detected, every grievance, every hidden hatred, every suppressed dream rushes toward that crack with the force of a flood. The first major crack came not during Nicholas's reign, but during his grandfather's. In the 1850s, Russia fought the Crimean War against Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. It was a catastrophic humiliation. Russia, a giant land empire, could not supply its own troops by land as efficiently as its enemies could by sea. Its soldiers fought with smoothbore muskets, while the French and British were armed with rifled barrels. The war exposed the rotting infrastructure of an army that was still organized like a feudal levy. Alexander II realized that Russia could not survive as a great power without modernization. He freed the serfs, he reformed the courts, he relaxed censorship, and for this, exactly for trying to drag his country toward the light, the revolutionaries of his time condemned him to death. On March 13, 1881, Alexander II was riding through St. Petersburg in a carriage when a bomb was thrown under the wheels. The explosion shattered the carriage but left the Tsar unharmed. He stepped out to check on the wounded Cossacks and bystanders. As he stood there, a second terrorist stepped forward and threw another bomb directly at his feet. The blast shredded Alexander's legs. His stomach was torn open. He was carried, a bleeding ruin, to the Winter Palace, where his son, the future Alexander III, watched him die in agony. The terrorists who killed him were members of a group called the People's Will. The assassination of Alexander II had a profound and lasting impact on the empire, but its darkest echo came 6 years later. In 1887, a group of young revolutionaries plotted to kill the new Tsar, Alexander III. Among those arrested and executed was a brilliant university student named Alexander Ulyanov. His final words to his grieving mother were, "There is nothing for me to forgive. I knew what I was doing." What he did not know was that he had left his younger brother, a teenager in the provincial city of Simbirsk, with a simmering rage that would one day consume the world. His name was Vladimir, but the world would come to know him as Lenin. But that is getting ahead of our story. For now, the assassination of Alexander II had a terrible, predictable consequence. His son, Alexander III, was a giant of a man, a bear in human form, who could bend iron pokers with his bare hands and who had watched his father bleed out on a palace floor. He decided that his father's mistake had been weakness. Reform, he believed, was a poison. The only way to rule Russia was with an iron fist. He rolled back the liberalization, crushed dissent with savage efficiency, and handed his son, Nicholas, a ruthless political worldview. The reactionary maxim that Russia likes to feel the whip was widely echoed in his court. He also, tragically, handed his son a profound sense of inadequacy. Alexander III was a forceful, intimidating presence. Nicholas was a small, soft-spoken man with gentle eyes and a deep, almost mystical belief in his own destiny and a profound fear of his father's memory. When Alexander III died suddenly of kidney failure in 1894, Nicholas was 26. He told his cousin, "I am not prepared to be a Tsar, I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." He was by nature a family man. His great love was his German wife, Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Theirs was a love story of genuine devotion, a romantic island in the storm of imperial politics. But Alexandra was intensely shy, deeply religious, and fanatically committed to the principle of autocracy. She believed, even more rigidly than Nicholas, that his power came directly from God, and that sharing it with a parliament would be a sin against heaven. She was also the bearer of a genetic curse that would help destroy the dynasty. Alexandra was a carrier of haemophilia, the bleeding disease that prevents blood from clotting. She passed it to her only son, the Tsarevich Alexei. The heir to the Russian throne was a child who could bleed to death from a simple bruise, whose slightest fall could cause hours of agony as blood pooled painfully in his joints. The imperial family hid this secret from the Russian public at all costs. The boy's illness became a wound at the heart of the court, a source of constant terror and desperate prayer. And it was into this wound that one of the strangest and most destructive figures in Russian history would soon crawl: Grigory Rasputin. But before Rasputin, before the war, before the revolution, Nicholas gave his empire a preview of his reign in a disaster that seemed to stain his crown from the very first day. His coronation in Moscow in 1896 was a spectacle of unprecedented opulence, but on the day set aside for public celebration, a mass gathering was organized on the Kodinka field outside the city. Rumors had spread that free food, beer, and commemorative mugs would be distributed. 500,000 people gathered on a field that was pitted with trenches and holes, left over from military exercises. When the gates opened, the crowd surged forward. People tripped. They fell into the hidden trenches. Those behind, unaware, kept pushing. The crowd compacted into a suffocating mass. By the time the panic subsided, over 1,300 people had been trampled or suffocated to death. Their bodies, blue-faced and crushed, were piled onto carts and taken away. And that night, the new Tsar and Tsarina attended a glittering ball at the French embassy. Nicholas had not wanted to go. He was grief-stricken, but his advisors, fearing diplomatic insult, convinced him. The image of the Tsar dancing while his subjects buried their dead in mass graves was a wound that never healed. The whispers began. The reign has begun with Kodinka. It will end with Kodinka. The year 1905 arrived like a thunderclap. Russia, still smarting from its internal tensions, stumbled into a war on the far side of the world. The expanding Russian Empire had been pushing into Manchuria and Korea, colliding with the equally hungry ambitions of a newly modernized Japan. Nicholas and his court viewed Japan with racial contempt. The Tsar referred to the Japanese as macaques, monkeys. He believed that a short, victorious war would rally the nation behind the throne and wash away the stain of domestic discontent. Instead, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 was an unmitigated catastrophe. The Russian army, sent halfway around the world on a single, incomplete railway, was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and humiliated on land. Then, in May 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed all the way around Europe, down the coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and into the Sea of Japan, was annihilated in a single afternoon at the Battle of Tsushima. The Tsar's navy was at the bottom of the sea. The illusion of Russian military might evaporated overnight. The empire, already a pressure cooker, now began to explode. Strikes broke out across the cities. University students walked out of lectures. Peasants set fire to manor houses in the countryside. And on January 22, 1905, a date that would be burned into Russian memory as Bloody Sunday, a massive, peaceful procession of workers and their families marched toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They were led by a priest, Father Gapon. They carried icons and portraits of the Tsar. They sang hymns. They were not revolutionaries. They were petitioners. They were coming to beg their little father, the Tsar, for help. For an 8-hour workday, for fair wages, for an end to a war that was devouring their sons. They believed, with a naive and heartbreaking faith, that if only the Tsar knew of their suffering, he would extend his loving hand to save them. Nicholas was not even in the palace. He was outside the city, but his troops were there. As the vast, singing crowd approached the palace square, lines of soldiers blocked their path. The crowd kept coming, children in their arms, women in their best shawls. The soldiers lifted their rifles, and then they opened fire. The volleys crashed into the unarmed crowd. People fell, screaming. The soldiers fired again and again. The snow turned red. Cavalry charged into the fleeing masses, slashing with sabers. Over 100 people were killed, hundreds more wounded. Bloody Sunday shattered the mystical bond between Tsar and people. The little father had ordered his children to be gunned down in the street. The idea of a benevolent, patriarchal Tsar was exploded in that moment. News of the massacre rippled across the entire empire, igniting a revolution. Worker and peasant councils, born spontaneously, began to form. They called themselves Soviets, a simple Russian word meaning council. The 1905 revolution nearly toppled the Romanov dynasty. For an entire year, Russia was in chaos. A general strike paralyzed the country. Sailors on the battleship Potemkin mutinied. Peasants across the Black Earth regions seized land, burning the estates of the nobility, chasing landlords into the night. In St. Petersburg, a Soviet of workers' deputies was formed, led by a fiery young Marxist with a shock of wild hair and spectacles that caught the light, Leon Trotsky. For the first time, the Russian people had a voice, and that voice was a roar. The Tsar, terrified and cornered, was forced to make concessions. In October 1905, he issued a manifesto promising civil liberties and the creation of a parliament, the Duma. The liberal middle classes, satisfied with this promise of constitutional monarchy, peeled away from the revolution. The state then turned its full fury on the workers and peasants. Troops were dispatched to crush the St. Petersburg Soviet. Arrests swept through the working-class districts. Punitive expeditions, their wagons known as Stolypin's neckties, after the prime minister who ordered them, hanged thousands of peasants from telegraph poles. By 1906, the revolution was over. The Tsar, having regained his footing, immediately began to claw back the concessions he had made. The Duma, when it proved too radical, was sent home. The fundamental structure of autocracy remained intact, but a seed had been planted. The Soviets, those improvised councils of workers, had tasted power. More importantly, they had learned how to organize. The revolution of 1905 was a dress rehearsal. The actors had practiced their lines. The next time the curtain rose, they would not be so easily defeated. For the next decade, Russia limped along, a colossus with a hidden cancer. The Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, tried to reform the countryside, creating a class of independent peasant farmers who might be loyal to the throne. He was assassinated by a revolutionary in 1911, shot in front of the Tsar at the Kiev Opera House. With Stolypin died the last best hope for evolutionary change. The court retreated further into its own world. And in that world, the shadow of Rasputin grew ever darker. Rasputin. Even the name sounds like a curse. He was a peasant from Siberia, a wandering holy man, a starets. He had wild, hypnotic eyes, a matted beard, and a reputation for spiritual power and sexual depravity. He was brought to the palace by the Montenegrin princesses, two social climbers who recognized his potential for influence. But Rasputin's power became absolute when he demonstrated an almost miraculous ability. He could stop the young Tsarevich Alexei's bleeding, whether it was genuine healing, hypnotic suggestion, or simply the fact that he calmed the hysterical Tsarina and forbade the use of aspirin, a new medicine that, unknown at the time, actually worsened haemophilia by thinning the blood. We may never know for certain. But to Alexandra, this filthy, mesmerizing peasant was a saint sent by God to save her son. She trusted him absolutely. She called him our friend. and she refused to hear a word against him, even as the entire empire seethed with scandal. The rumors were toxic. Rasputin, it was whispered, was not just a holy man, but a drunkard and a sex addict who caroused with prostitutes, accepted bribes for government appointments, and had a deeply inappropriate relationship with the Tsarina and her daughters. The press, which had been partially liberated, fed the public a steady diet of Rasputin stories. Cartoons depicted him as a demonic figure looming over the throne. The aristocracy was horrified. The people were disgusted. The monarchy, which had once worn the sacred robes of divine right, now seemed to be ruled by a debauched peasant mystic and a hysterical German woman. During the World War that was coming, that German woman detail would prove lethal. Then, in June 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots into Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in the streets of Sarajevo. The great powers of Europe, bound by a web of alliances, stumbled into war. Russia, as the self-proclaimed protector of the Slavic peoples in the Balkans, mobilized to defend its ally Serbia. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. In a matter of days, the entire continent was at war. In St. Petersburg, patriotically renamed Petrograd because Berg sounded too German, crowds waving flags and icons cheered the Tsar. The initial mood was one of national unity. The war, it was thought, would be over by Christmas. It would purify the nation, wash away the stain of Rasputin, and unite all classes against the foreign enemy. The Russian army was enormous. It was called the Russian steamroller. But within weeks, the steamroller began to break down. The army was poorly equipped, poorly led, and disastrously supplied. Some units were so poorly equipped that soldiers were sent to the front with orders to pick up the rifles of fallen comrades. They were sent against German machine guns and artillery in human waves, their bodies piling up like cordwood. By the end of 1914, the original professional army had been essentially destroyed. The Tsar's regime was now sending raw recruits, peasants from the villages, into the meat grinder, and in 1915, Nicholas made the single worst decision of his entire reign. He assumed personal command of the army. His ministers begged him not to. They warned him that if he went to the front, he would be personally blamed for every future defeat. But Nicholas, urged on by Alexandra and Rasputin, believed it was his sacred duty. He rode off to the military headquarters at Mogilev, leaving the government of the empire in the hands of his wife. And his wife was, in turn, guided entirely by Rasputin. The results were catastrophic. As 1915 turned into 1916, the disaster deepened. Casualty figures became unspeakable. Over 5 million Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the first 2 years of the war. At the front, men starved, froze, and died in mud-filled trenches. Back home, the economy was collapsing. The railways, needed for the war effort, could not transport food to the cities. Grain rotted in the countryside, while women fainted in bread lines in Petrograd. Inflation spiraled out of control. Factories closed for lack of fuel and raw materials, throwing thousands of workers onto the frozen streets. And all the while, the government in Petrograd seemed to be a revolving door of incompetent ministers, appointed and dismissed at the whim of a Siberian mystic. The sense of impending doom was palpable. In November 1916, the liberal leader Pavel Milyukov stood up in the Duma and delivered a blistering speech, listing every failure of the government. After each charge, he asked the chamber, "Is this stupidity or is it treason?" The implication was clear. The Empress, the German woman, was betraying the country. The speech was officially censored, but it was copied by hand and distributed across the country. It was a funeral oration for the monarchy, even if the body was still technically breathing. The breathing stopped, in a sense, on a cold night in December 1916. A group of aristocrats, including a prince and a relative of the Tsar by marriage, decided that Rasputin had to die. They lured him to a palace basement in Petrograd, fed him poisoned cakes and wine, and when the poison inexplicably failed, shot him, bludgeoned him, and finally threw his body into the freezing waters of the Neva River. The murder of Rasputin was celebrated across Russia. The conspirators were hailed as heroes, but it solved nothing. The cancer was not in Rasputin. He was merely a symptom. The cancer was the system itself, and it was terminal. By February 1917, Russia was a frozen, starving powder keg. The winter was brutal, the coldest in memory. The temperature in Petrograd dropped to -35 degrees Celsius. Fuel supplies ran out. Bakeries closed. On February 23rd, which was International Women's Day, the women of Petrograd had had enough. They were textile workers, mothers, wives of soldiers at the front. They left their factories and marched into the streets, shouting for bread. They went from mill to mill, banging on the doors, pulling the men out. "Come with us, we need bread, we need an end to this war," they shouted. The demonstration grew and grew, a tide of exhausted, furious humanity sweeping through the wide, snowy avenues of the capital. Tsar Nicholas, at his headquarters hundreds of miles away, sent a terse telegram. "I command you to suppress the disorders in the capital by tomorrow. They cannot be permitted at this difficult time of war with Germany and Austria." The military governor of Petrograd read the order. And then, on the morning of February 26th, he gave the command to fire. The soldiers of the Petrograd garrison were not the hardened veterans who had crushed the 1905 revolution. They were raw recruits, young men drafted from the same villages as the women in the streets. They were workers in uniform. They looked down the barrels of their rifles at the crowd and saw faces that looked like their mothers, their sisters, their wives. The first volley was fired into the air. The crowd did not disperse. Then, the officers ordered them to fire into the people, and something inside those soldiers snapped. That morning, a company of the Pavlovsky Regiment fired at their own officers instead of the crowd. By the end of the day, regiment after regiment had mutinied. Soldiers poured into the streets, not to disperse the crowd, but to join it. They shot their commanding officers. They distributed weapons to the workers. The city was now in the hands of armed revolutionary masses. The government had lost control of its own military force in the capital. That single fact turned a protest into a revolution. In a matter of days, the Tsar's world collapsed. His generals, realizing that the situation was beyond saving, urged him to abdicate. They feared that if he did not, the revolution would sweep away not just him, but the entire monarchy and perhaps the army itself. On March 2nd, 1917, in the lounge of his imperial train, stranded on a siding in the town of Pskov, Nicholas II signed a decree of abdication. He gave up the throne in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael. Michael, sensibly, declined the poisoned chalice the very next day. 304 years of Romanov rule were over. The February Revolution was astonishingly rapid and almost completely unplanned. No revolutionary party had organized it. Lenin himself, the supposed mastermind, was stuck in neutral Switzerland, completely caught off guard. When the news reached him, he was dumbfounded. A revolution had happened, and he was not there. He would move heaven and earth to get back, but in the meantime, power in Russia lay in an unprecedented, unstable, and utterly chaotic arrangement known as the dual power. Two authorities claimed the allegiance of the people. One was the provisional government, formed from the old liberal members of the Duma, men of property and law who believed in a constitutional, democratic future for Russia. The other was the Petrograd Soviet, a sprawling, chaotic council of workers and soldiers' deputies that sprang back to life from the embers of 1905. The Soviet issued Order No. 1, an earth-shattering document that told soldiers they could form their own committees and need only obey the government's orders if the Soviet agreed. From its very first breath, the Soviet did not trust the provisional government, and it was the Soviet that held the real power, the loyalty of the armed masses in the streets. The government had the offices, the Soviet had the guns. The 8 months between February and October 1917 are one of the most extraordinary, tragic, and humanly dramatic periods in modern history. For a brief, shimmering moment, Russia was the freest country in the world. Censorship was abolished. The death penalty was ended. Political prisoners streamed back from Siberian exile to cheering crowds. Women gained the right to vote. The empire of the knout and the prison camp became, overnight, a chaotic, vibrant democracy. Every street corner in Petrograd became a parliament. Soldiers, workers, students, and housewives argued about the future of the nation. Endless meetings were held, endless speeches were given, and at the heart of it all was the promise, the long-awaited dream, of a constituent assembly, a democratic parliament elected by universal suffrage that would write a new constitution and decide the fate of Russia once and for all. But there was a fatal flaw at the heart of this freedom. The war continued. The same war that had broken the Tsar was now slowly strangling the revolution. The provisional government, bound by treaties to its allies Britain and France, and anxious to prove its legitimacy, chose to continue fighting. This decision would prove to be its death sentence. The soldiers at the front, peasants in uniform, wanted only one thing: to go home. Back in their villages, the great desire was land. For centuries, the peasants had dreamed of the black repartition, the seizure and redistribution of the nobles' estates. They had waited patiently for a legal solution, but as the months passed and the provisional government delayed, saying that only the future Constituent Assembly could authorize land reform, the peasants stopped waiting. They began to take. All across rural Russia, peasant communes seized fields, chopped down forests, and burned manor houses. The anarchic, violent revolution from below was already happening, regardless of what the politicians in Petrograd said. The man who understood this better than anyone was Alexander Kerensky. He was a 36-year-old lawyer, a brilliant orator with a shock of dark hair and a theatrical flair, a member of the moderate Socialist Revolutionary Party. He was the rising star of the provisional government, the bridge between the liberal ministers and the Socialist Soviet. He believed, with passionate sincerity, that he could steer Russia between the twin dangers of military dictatorship on the right and Bolshevik anarchy on the left. He was hailed as the man of the people. When he spoke, crowds wept. But Kerensky, tragically, was a man of words in a time that demanded iron. His fatal decision was to launch a massive new military offensive in June 1917. He toured the front, standing on a table in muddy fields, whipping the demoralized troops into a patriotic frenzy. "Forward, free citizens of a free Russia," he cried, and for a few days, the offensive actually broke through the Austrian lines. But then the Germans counterattacked, and the Russian army simply disintegrated. Soldiers threw down their rifles and ran. The number of deserters swelled into the millions. The catastrophic failure of the June offensive detonated the next explosion. In the first days of July, Petrograd boiled over. Thousands of armed soldiers and workers, many of them influenced by the increasingly vocal Bolshevik faction, poured into the streets, shouting, "All power to the Soviets!" They surrounded the torrid palace where the Soviet was meeting. They seized a car containing a group of Soviet leaders. A burly, furious soldier shook his fist in the face of these moderate politicians and screamed a phrase that has echoed through history. "Take power, you sons of bitches, when it is given to you." But the Soviet leaders were afraid. Taking power meant taking responsibility for the war, the famine, the collapsing economy. They preferred to negotiate, to pressure, to lobby. They left power in the hands of Kerensky and watched as he used loyal troops to crush the July Days uprising. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were blamed for the unrest. Their printing presses were smashed. Trotsky was arrested. Lenin, accused of being a German agent, fled across the border into Finland, disguised as a workman, hiding in a haystack at one terrifying moment. The Bolshevik movement seemed finished, exposed as a reckless, premature adventure. But history, as it often does, took a dizzying turn. The July uprising had frightened the propertied classes and the right-wing elements in the army. They had had enough of revolutionary chaos. They wanted a strong man to restore discipline. They found their man in General Lavr Kornilov, the newly appointed commander-in-chief, a fiery Cossack with a handlebar mustache and a deep loathing for socialists. In August, Kornilov launched a coup. He ordered his cavalry to march on Petrograd to crush the Soviet and establish military order. Kerensky, the prime minister, suddenly realized the threat came not from the left, but from the right. He had no troops loyal to him in the capital. In utter desperation, he turned to the very people he had just repressed, the Bolsheviks and the armed workers of the Petrograd Soviet. He released Bolshevik leaders from prison. He distributed weapons. He said effectively, "Save us from the counter-revolution, and we will deal with your differences later." The Bolsheviks didn't need to fight. Railway workers, acting under Soviet influence, simply diverted Kornilov's trains. Agitators met the advancing cavalry, talked to the soldiers, and convinced them to desert their officers. The coup collapsed without a shot being fired. Kornilov was arrested, but the damage was done. The right wing was discredited and destroyed. Kerensky was revealed as a powerless figurehead who needed the Bolsheviks to save him. And the Bolsheviks, now armed and legitimized, surged in popularity. Leon Trotsky, released from prison, was elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. One by one, Soviets across the country swung to the Bolshevik majority. While Kerensky's government staggered from crisis to crisis, life for ordinary people descended into a nightmare. The famine in the cities grew catastrophic. The daily bread ration in Petrograd was reduced to £0.25 per person, a dry crust to survive the day. The streets were unlit. Garbage piled up uncollected. The cold seeped into every apartment. The soundscape of the city was a constant murmur of fear. The distant rumble of artillery, the whistle of wind through broken windows, the shuffling of endless hungry queues. A journalist at the time described the mood. The city is dying. The soul is leaving it. Wow. While the poor clawed through the garbage for scraps, a bizarre, feverish carnival of the rich continued in the private clubs and back rooms of the capital. Champagne still flowed. Million-ruble gambling debts were incurred. Aristocrats sold off their jewels and paintings at a fraction of their worth, hoping to flee. The contrast was obscene. A worker would pass a cafe window, his stomach cramping from hunger, and see a merchant's wife draped in a fur coat, laughing, a glass of wine in her gloved hand. This was the kind of chasm that made peace impossible. It was in this darkening autumn that Lenin made his final, decisive move. From his hiding place in Finland, he bombarded the Bolshevik Central Committee with furious letters. "History will not forgive us if we do not take power now," he wrote. "The masses have the right to smash their enemies. We must not wait." Most of the Bolshevik leaders, including cautious figures like Zinoviev and Kamenev, were horrified. They believed an uprising was premature. They wanted to wait for the upcoming Congress of Soviets to transfer power legally. But Lenin was not a man for legalities when the gun was available. He returned secretly to Petrograd, disguised, clean-shaven, wearing a wig, and met the Central Committee in a cramped apartment on the city's outskirts. He argued through the night, pounding the table, his voice hoarse with passion. He faced a room full of men who had seen the July days crushed, who knew the state could still fire back. He answered them with one phrase: "The situation is completely ripe for the transfer of power." Finally, by a narrow margin, they agreed. A military revolutionary committee was formed, chaired by the organizational genius of Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was the perfect counterpart to Lenin. Lenin was the strategy. Trotsky was the execution. He moved through the city, coolly and efficiently, securing the loyalty of the garrison, arranging the distribution of weapons, mapping the key points, the bridges, the telegraph stations, the railway junctions, the telephone exchange. The plan was not a romantic storming of a fortress. It was a surgical, almost bureaucratic seizure of infrastructure. The goal was to present the Congress of Soviets, when it met, with a fait accompli. The government would simply no longer exist. On the morning of October 24th, Alexander Kerensky finally decided to act. He ordered the shutting down of the Bolshevik printing presses and the arrest of their leaders. It was the exact provocation Lenin and Trotsky had been waiting for. Trotsky, sitting in the Smolny Institute, the headquarters of the Soviet, received the news calmly. "Excellent," he said. The denouement. The Bolsheviks declared that a counter-revolutionary attack had begun. They called on their Red Guards and the garrison to defend the Congress of Soviets. And then, with astonishing methodical smoothness, they began to take the city. It was not a battle. It was an occupation. Small detachments of armed workers and soldiers, wearing mismatched uniforms and civilian jackets, carrying rifles and machine guns, moved quietly through the freezing, foggy streets. They walked into the main railway stations, showed warrants signed by the Military Revolutionary Committee, and told the guards to go home. They did the same at the post office, the telegraph agency, the state bank, and the central power plants. There was almost no resistance. The government had no one left to fight. Kerensky, realizing the building was collapsing around him, scrambled for a car. He found one at the American embassy, a vehicle with a little stars and stripes pennant fluttering from the hood. He climbed in and fled the city, heading toward the front, desperately hoping to find loyal troops. He would find none. By the evening of October 24th, the Bolsheviks controlled the capital, except for one place, the Winter Palace. The cabinet of the provisional government, a handful of exhausted middle-aged men in suits, were huddled inside, protected by a women's shock battalion, some military cadets, and a few Cossacks who had eaten the government's food and then, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, wandered away. The palace, that vast, breathtaking symbol of Romanov absolutism, was a hollow shell. At 9:40 p.m., a blank shot boomed out across the dark, icy waters of the Neva River. It came from the forecastle gun of the cruiser Aurora, a warship whose crew had mutinied and joined the Bolsheviks. It was the signal. The Red Guards, led by Antonov Ovsenko, crept through the square, across the barricades and into the palace. The storming of the Winter Palace, immortalized in Soviet paintings and Sergei Eisenstein's epic film October, was nothing like the myth. There were no thousands of heroic proletarians scaling the gates in a glorious wave. The defenders inside had mostly sat down to a meal of soup in the palace kitchens. The attackers simply filtered through the back doors, lost themselves in the labyrinth of corridors, and eventually found their way to the Malachite Hall. Antonov Ovsenko, with a small group of men behind him, pushed open the door and found the ministers sitting around a table covered in papers. "In the name of the Military Revolutionary Committee, I declare you under arrest," he said. The ministers handed over their weapons. They were marched out into the night, through jeering crowds of sailors, to the Peter and Paul fortress. The provisional government of Russia had fallen. The October Revolution had taken fewer than 5 hours of actual combat. 6 people died. 6. The next night, October 25th, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets convened at the Smolny Institute. The Great Hall was packed with soldiers in muddy boots, workers in leather jackets, and a sea of cigarette smoke. The Bolsheviks now had a majority, but the other socialist parties, the Mensheviks and the Right Socialist Revolutionaries, were still present. A Menshevik delegate, pale with fury, stood up and denounced the coup as a criminal adventure that would destroy the revolution. Another speaker pointed a trembling finger at the Bolsheviks. "You are driving Russia into civil war." Trotsky, seated on the podium, his eyes gleaming behind his glasses, rose to his feet. "Go where you belong from now on," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "into the dustbin of history." The Mensheviks and moderate socialists, in a catastrophic act of protest, walked out of the Congress. They believed they were isolating the Bolsheviks, condemning them to rule alone and fail. Instead, they handed Lenin an absolute majority and an unchallenged path to power. They had cleared the field. At that moment, Vladimir Lenin appeared. He had been in hiding for months. Now he walked into the smoke-filled hall, his eyes squinting under the harsh electric lights, a faint, weary smile on his lips. The ovation was thunderous. He stood at the podium, grasped the lectern and waited for the roar to subside. When he spoke, he did not scream. He did not rant. He spoke with a quiet, relentless conviction. "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order," he said. The Congress erupted again. That night, Lenin read his two foundational decrees. The decree on peace proposed an immediate end to the war, a truce without annexations or indemnities, a direct appeal to the soldiers of all the belligerent nations to stop fighting and come home. The decree on land abolished all private ownership of land without compensation and gave it over to the peasant communes for redistribution. It was a stroke of political genius. The land decree was not Bolshevik policy. It was the peasant policy of the socialist revolutionaries. Lenin had simply stolen his enemy's program to buy the loyalty of the villagers: peace and land, the two things the masses wanted most. In a single hour, Lenin had bound the vast, hungry, exhausted nation to his fragile regime. The revolution had won its first and most crucial battle, the battle of promises. The promises were intoxicating: peace, land, bread. But promises, as Lenin himself would soon demonstrate, are the cheapest currency of revolution. The Bolsheviks had seized power in the name of the Soviets, shouting, "All power to the Soviets." But from the very day Lenin stepped into the Smolny Institute, the real power of those grassroots councils began to wither. Real power was now concentrated in the Council of People's Commissars, a Bolshevik-only cabinet chaired by Lenin, and in the iron fist of the new secret police, the Cheka. The revolution still had one last democratic obligation to fulfill: the Constituent Assembly. The elections, which had been promised since the fall of the Tsar, were held in November. In the first, and what would be the last, free election in Russia for 7 decades, the Bolsheviks did well in the cities, but they were crushed in the countryside. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, the party of the peasants, won a landslide majority. Russia, given a free choice, had voted for a multi-party, agrarian socialist democracy. It had not voted for a Bolshevik dictatorship. The assembly met on January 5, 1918, in the Tauride Palace. The mood was electric with hope. Crowds of workers and soldiers, supporters of the assembly, marched through the streets carrying banners reading, "All power to the Constituent Assembly." They were met by machine gun fire from Bolshevik Red Guards. The marchers scattered, their blood staining the snow. The message was clear: democracy would not be tolerated. Inside the palace, the assembly opened. The SR leader, Viktor Chernov, was elected chairman over the Bolshevik candidate. For a few hours, Russia had a real parliament. But Lenin and his lieutenants sitting in the balcony watched with cold, growing irritation. At 4 in the morning, a sailor from the Bolshevik security detail, a man named Zheleznyakov, walked up to Chernov, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "The guard is tired. I must ask you to close the meeting." The Constituent Assembly, the great hope of the Russian Revolution, was dissolved. It never met again. When supporters of the assembly protested the next day, Bolshevik troops fired into the unarmed crowds, killing and wounding dozens. The decision to close the assembly was the true turning point, the moment the Russian Revolution fractured into a civil war. As one historian wrote, "By this action, Lenin really breaks with the revolution as it had happened. It pushes the Bolsheviks down the road of authoritarianism and dictatorship. If you cannot be voted out of office, your opponents have only one option left: to take up arms against you." The civil war that followed from 1918 to 1921 was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The Bolsheviks, now calling themselves the Russian Communist Party, controlled a shrinking island of territory in central Russia, a besieged fortress surrounded by a ring of enemies known as the Whites. The Whites were a chaotic amalgamation of Tsarist generals, Cossacks, liberal politicians, and peasant partisans, united only by their hatred of the Bolsheviks. They were supported by a dozen foreign powers: Britain, France, the United States, Japan, who sent troops and supplies to strangle the communist experiment in its cradle. For a time, the Bolshevik regime seemed doomed. Lenin was shot and badly wounded by a socialist revolutionary assassin in August 1918. The White Armies advanced to within artillery range of Moscow. It was in this crucible of total war that the Soviet state was forged, and it was forged in blood. Leon Trotsky, appointed Commissar for War, achieved the impossible. He took a ragtag militia and built the Red Army, a disciplined force of 5 million men. He traveled the front lines in an armored train, a mobile propaganda and command center, rallying troops, organizing supply lines and issuing ruthless orders. Deserters were shot. Entire regiments that retreated without orders were subjected to decimation. Every 10th man executed. This was the Red Terror, a wave of state-directed violence designed not just to defeat the enemy, but to eliminate the very concept of an enemy within. The Cheka, under the gaunt, fanatical Felix Dzerzhinsky, was given limitless power to arrest, torture, and execute class enemies. Thousands, then tens of thousands, were shot in cellars, their bodies dumped in mass graves. And it was in this atmosphere of industrialized killing that the fate of the Romanov family was sealed. They had been moved eastward, deeper into the interior, until they reached the House of Special Purpose in Ekaterinburg. As the White Army approached the city in July 1918, the local Soviet leaders in the Urals, with the implicit or explicit approval of Lenin and the central leadership in Moscow, decided that the imperial family could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. They could not be a living banner for the counter-revolution. The decision was taken to exterminate them. Every last one. The soldiers were given revolvers. The order was given. And in the basement of that house, the man who had once been the most powerful autocrat on earth watched his son tremble, heard his wife scream, and saw his daughters try to shield themselves with their arms before the bullets and the bayonets tore them apart. The children did not die quickly. The jewels sewn into their corsets deflected the first shots. The assassins had to finish them with bayonets. It was a scene of such pure, primal horror that even the killers, hardened soldiers of the Cheka, were shaken. The execution of the Romanovs was not an accident of war. It was the logical endpoint of a political philosophy that had abandoned all moral restraint in the pursuit of a utopian future. The revolution had promised to end the killing. It had promised dignity for the downtrodden. But in the venomous atmosphere of civil war, it had become the very thing it swore to destroy, an autocracy of terror. By 1921, the Red Army had won the civil war. The whites were broken, scattered to exile, or dead. The foreign interventionist forces had sailed home, defeated and discredited. Lenin's regime stood triumphant. But it was a triumph over a wasteland. The economy had ceased to exist. Industrial production had fallen to a fraction of its pre-war level. A devastating famine swept the Volga region. A famine made worse by Bolshevik grain requisitioning policies. Over 5 million people starved to death, their bodies lying unburied in the fields. The total death toll of the First World War, the Revolution, and the Civil War was somewhere between 10 and 15 million souls. The price of utopia was a charnel house. Lenin, his health shattered by the assassination attempt and a series of strokes, watched with growing horror as the state he had created began to reveal its true nature. In his final months confined to a wheelchair, unable to speak, he dictated his last testament. He warned of the ambition and rudeness of the man who had risen to become general secretary of the party, a Georgian with a pockmarked face and a cold, patient cruelty named Joseph Stalin. Lenin called for Stalin to be removed, but his warning came too late. The party apparatus had already fallen into Stalin's hands. When Lenin died on January 21, 1924, his body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Red Square, a sacred relic of a faith that was already betraying its founder. The man Lenin had dismissed as a useful handyman now stood alone atop the pyramid of power. Joseph Stalin took the totalitarian machinery that Lenin and Trotsky had built to win the Civil War and turned it on the nation itself. The secret police, the labor camps, the surveillance, the ideological terror. All of it was refined and expanded into a system of total control. The collectivization of agriculture and the forced industrialization of the 1930s would result in famines engineered by the state, killing millions in the breadbaskets of Ukraine and Russia. The Great Terror of the 1930s would send millions more to the gulags or the execution cellars. Stalin would become responsible for the deaths of some 20 million of his own people. The revolution that had begun with women marching for bread had evolved into a machine that devoured its own children. And so we return to that basement in Ekaterinburg, with the smoke clearing and the bodies still. The Romanovs were dead. The old world was buried. But the new world, born of such immense hope, was already rotting from within. The promises of 1917, peace, land and bread, had been paid for with a mountain of corpses. The ideals of dignity and respect had been twisted into a regime of terror that would last for 3/4 of a century. The Russian Revolution was not a simple story of good versus evil. It was a tragedy in the classical sense, a story of human beings, with all their genius and all their blindness, attempting to build heaven on earth, only to find that the tools they used, violence, lies, and absolute power, could only ever build a prison. The real question that echoes from the streets of 1917 Petrograd is not who won, but what was lost. What was lost was a fleeting, beautiful, and terrifying moment when it seemed like ordinary people might actually control their own destiny. Today, in Moscow, you can visit Lenin's mausoleum. His waxy, embalmed body still lies there, a century later, a tourist attraction more than a monument. Across Moscow, far from Red Square, stands the Wall of Sorrow, a memorial to the millions of victims of political repression. Though physically distant, the two monuments embody an unresolved, silent conflict in Russian memory. The revolution is over, but its ghosts still walk the frozen streets, whispering the eternal warning that power, once unleashed in the name of the people, has a terrifying habit of forgetting the sounds of their voices. They promised paradise, but as a cruel joke of fate, they built a hell whose name still echoes, in whispers, in the frozen basements of history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the epic, terrifying, and deeply human story of the Russian Revolution. If you believe that understanding the past is the only way to truly see the world around us today, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. History is not just a series of dates, it is the story of us, of our hopes, our failures, and our eternal struggle for something better. The promises of 1917 were broken, but the desire for dignity that drove those women into the streets of Petrograd, that is a fire that can never be fully extinguished.